then. Adriana, over to you. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Can you hear me well? Everything is fine, no noise?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, good. Okay, so thank you for having me. I think that we're benefiting a little bit of this current situation, since we can share and the borders are not interfering here. So what I'm presenting today is part of a larger project. It's a 3-year project with a fund from Luberhand Fund. And we are 3 people working currently in this project. John Love is the PI, myself, and then Antonia Ruppel. She also works on teaching Sanskrit pedagogy and also on Sanskrit grammar. And we have been trying to work on a very large corpus and trying to re-examine some of the main or very interesting syntactic phenomena in Sanskrit, namely passive, well, causatives or passive causatives, control, and anaphora. These are like the 3 main topics that we have been working on. We already started on control, and we are hopefully finishing soon with passive causatives. And next year we'll be starting with anaphora, or even sooner than that. So the main idea is to see if what is being said about Sanskrit is still relevant or not in the light of the current linguistic theories. What has happened in the past is that people have focused only on one text, so one drama or one narrative, but they haven't had access to like a wide range of data, right? So what we did is we created this large corpus. So in theory, or what we can calculate, we have over 5 million words, but then we have to consider that most texts don't have the Sandy and Dunn, so that could easily double or triple. So it's a large corpus, and it includes different genres. So it includes narrative, we have some Puranas, we have, well, a selection of Puranas, because you know that that's very like large material. We also have lots of narratives. We have some Shastra. So we have a selection of different genres, and the idea is also to see if we are able to trace some developments in this when we study these different phenomena. Okay, so this part, what we are presenting today, is what we have gathered so far on Sanskrit Causatives. So we started with only passives, and then they expanded to the active, and we wanted to see if there was a correspondence in the pattern. Okay, so why are Sanskrit Causatives so interesting? Well, causatives in Sanskrit are very productive, and the same with passives. And this cannot happen in every language in the world, and is the fact that causatives can be passivized in Sanskrit. So we don't have the causative of a passive, but rather we have the passive of the causative. This is something that is important just to keep in mind, because that's a later, passive is a later development. So as I said, these are very productive in Sanskrit. So you have in the first section, I'm not anything here, so we have an example of simple forms, causative forms, and the passives. So the main focus of this project is, especially in classic Sanskrit, on causative of transitive verbs. Why transitive verbs? Because then we can have at least like a richer argument structure, right? We can have the causer, we potentially could have the embedded subject and the embedded object. So these transitive verbs will mean to cause someone to do something, right? Like whatever the basic verb is. And we want to examine the patterns of passivization on the embedded object and on the embedded subject, as well as the argument structure of the active causatives. And what we find is that the main structure has been accusative or oblique accusative in the corpus data, okay? So a little bit of a background. The aya suffix, we find it in early Vedic or in the Mantric Vedic. And what we find there is pretty much what we find in Proto-Indo-European, which is that this suffix is used in a variety of, with a variety of meanings, right? So it can be used in intransitive to make them transitives, or just with transitives, but without a causative meaning, and non-exclusive causatives. That means that sometimes it could have the causative meaning, sometimes it could have the transitive meaning, and then the proper, or what we call genuine causatives. Now, some limitations with this Vedic data is that it's mostly in the present tense. Then causatives or transitive verbs is still comparatively rare. And the most important part is that we don't find causative passives in this text, because this is a later development. And limited possible argument structures, and I'm gonna go into this. Okay, so not all the argument structures are present in the data in Vedic at this stage. When we move into classical Sanskrit, and that's section 0.22, then we see that this starts specializing a little bit more on causative. So we have more this causative function, although we have a divide. So we have this, what we call the class 10 verbs in Sanskrit. So we have, for example, to tail a cat, it remains the transitive meaning, or to choose, vri, it also remains with the transitive meaning. So this is not really causative. And this non-causative reading is very interesting, that we find it in verbs with nasal presence. So it seems to be, again, related to this class 10 group of verbs. And then we have the proper causatives. So for example, vish, to enter, vishati enters, vishayati causes to enter. And the class 10 seems to develop from the nominative verbs using the suffix ya. So, I mean, it's connected with the Proto-Indo-European one, but they're different usages, okay? So we are again focusing on the classical Sanskrit period, because we actually find more instances of proper causatives. Now, what happens with Sanskrit causatives, with the active? Why are they interesting? Well, it seems that there are two types of argument structures for active causatives formed two transitive verbs. Again, we are only focusing on transitive verbs, right? And one of the structures is accusative accusative. The other one is what we call here oblique accusative, which in reality tends to be more instrumental accusative. And again, I'm gonna go over this, develop this a little bit more later. Now, this instrumental accusative is not very common, if not at all found in early Vedic. So this is very interesting too, historically. And then what happens with the data, as always, is that most cases actually omit the causio of the embedded subject. So we really don't have much information about if it's accusative, accusative, or oblique accusative, because we only have accusative. But I'm gonna go into that later. So let's look at example 1. So this is a little bit clearer. So when we have a simple sentence, Devadatta makes a mat, we will have him be a causative 1. Jashnadatta makes Devadatta make a mat. Okay, so in this case, the one that is actually doing the action, what we call the embedded subject, is Devadatta. Okay, so Devadatta is here in accusative, and what Devadatta is making, the object, is also in accusative. Okay, so we call this a structure ak. Now in C, we see how this Devadatta will appear in instrumental instead. So Devadatena katam karayati. So Devadatta, again, is the one who is being made, make a mat or has a mat made by Devadatta, right? Now, what is interesting here is, and we don't want it to be like Right? Some people think that it's an artifact of the translation in English, but actually Sanskrit allows these two readings, which seems to be more like a passive reading in the active. And it's usually a little bit confusing, but these are the two readings that actually are allowed here in the act, within the what we call active. And then in D, which is what I told you, that is what we are finding more commonly in the data, is that we don't know who actually makes it. We only know that Yajnadatta has made a man, right? Or a mad maid. We don't know by whom. And this is where things become interesting, just to have a positive spin here, right? And now so again, active, just to recap, we have two types of argument structure, ak and oblique ak. And then with the passives, we also have two patterns. So in Sanskrit, you can passivize the object, the embedded object, or you can passivize the embedded subject. When we passivize the embedded subject, we call these constructions PCS, which is 2A. So Devadatta is made to cut the wood by Yajnadatta. And when you can passivize the object, we call this PCO. And that's the case in B, 2B. So the wood is made to be cut by Devadatta, by Yajnadatta. Now, this is in theory what you could have, but of course, the actual data is never as clean as what in theory we have. So we have two questions. After just looking at the two patterns that we have in the actives and the passives, we wonder if we can account for the variation in the active and the passive, and if these two are somehow connected, right? Because this is a natural question, especially if you assume that the passive derives from the active, or these are two separate constructions. All these questions, all these assumptions actually surface here, right? It's an interesting parts. So what has been done in the past? What has been said in the past? Of course, we need to start with Panini, right? Because that's the basis of everything in linguistics, and when we do some historical work with Sanskrit. So what Panini says is that the default argument structure is actually inst-ak, and ak is used only with a subset of verbs, okay? So only the verbs of motion, perception, eating, producing a sound, and also intransitive verbs have ak constructions. And then there are two roots, khri and kri, so to take and to do, where ak is optional. So they alternate between ak and oblique ak. Okay, so those two are possible. So that's what Panini tells us. What about passive causatives? Well, Panini doesn't refer directly to any of this. Based on the commentaries and what people have assumed or derived from Panini, there should be a relationship between PCS in the passive and ak in the actives, and PCO in the passives, and oblique ak in the active. Okay, so but this again, this doesn't come directly from Panini. This has been an interpretation from Panini's system and Panini's assumptions. Now, in the modern or more recent scholarship, what we find is an emphasis on the semantics. Okay, so what they have argued is that whatever difference between ak and oblique ak is there actually derives from the semantics of the verb, especially the intended expression and affectedness or agency of the causee. In this particular case, we have the both opinions. So we have the scholars who argue that you will have the embedded subject in instrument when it's a lower agency, and some argue that it's the opposite. Whenever you have an accusative, that's a lower agency. And then we have other readings that is also, these are common notions also in causative studies, which is the contactive or non-contactive causation. So direct or non-direct causation. So this is what we find. Also, we don't really find like corpus studies. We found maybe, well, Bubenic focuses on one drama and then that's it. I mean, they just they haven't really done any corpus studies. Now, what about passive causatives? What is being said about passive causative is that passivization on the embedded object is rare. And in one of his works, Buvenic's works, he found only 2 instances with han, the root meaning to kill. But again, this is a small corpus, it's just 1 drama. And then the passive causative are not found in early Vedic, but that's it, what has been said about this. So what do we do? So we put together a list of all the possible forms in all the tenses, modes, and everything that is possible, and voice, that it was causative, and in the active and the middle and the passive. And so we extracted all the finite forms and also the passive participles of all possible causative stems. Now here we use the actual attested forms from Whitney, but we also look for some of the theoretical forms from the Spandi. Okay, so forms that theoretically should be able to exist, but we don't necessarily find or have found any instance. So from that extraction, from that search, so I use Python, so I created a Python code to be able to extract this from different domains, so either verses or paragraphs from the different data. And this also included all possible Sandy permutations, right? Because again, the corpus doesn't have, not all corpus has Sandy and done. So some of them come clustered like together. So in order to be able to extract all possible forms, then we had to have all possible Sandys. So you can imagine that the list was very long and was hard to create, but that generated over 8,000 hits. Now, what do you do with so much data? So just to clarify the process here, working with the data, at the beginning, we started working on passive causatives. So that's how we selected the root. So we went, okay, which of these have actually passive forms? Then we went through that. Then we thought, okay, which of these have the same form is a passive causative and a passive? So which of these have only a transitive meaning? Okay, in other words. So we removed all those roots with only transitive meaning and not causative meaning. So you can imagine that we exclude simple transitive from the class then. So most of these, as I said before, had nasal presence. So we remove all those roots like in point 1 here. So some of them are cut, to stop, or support, to break, to tear, to spread. We also removed intransitive verbs because some of roots have transitive meaning, right? So some of these causative were intransitive, then they got the suffix, they became transitive. So all these verbs that were ambiguous, we were not sure. I mean, it could be ambiguous between if they derive from the intransitive or a transitive root. We'd remove that. We also removed idiomatic usages. So certain roots, when you add the causative stem, so they change into a very idiomatic or obscure form. So for example, jña, to know, when you have the causative, it can mean not to make someone to know, but to give an order. So, or for example, bush, to eat, it can mean something like to feed with. So this kind of idiomatic usages we also remove, okay? So at the end, we ended up only with a small subset of roots, which we call genuine causatives. So these roots are truly transitive. So there is a possibility of finding a causator, causee, an object in the active. And also there is the possibility of having PCS or PCO in the passive. And they are semantically regular and productive, okay? And so from a total of 8,000 hits, we ended up with an actual number of 1,204 tokens, what we call genuine causatives. So this is very interesting because this is what happens when ambition hits reality, when we work with corpus, right? Because we want to have the access to big data. But then at the end, when you start filtering, I started to analyze the data, starting to run into all these particularities of the language, then you realize that, of course, this is very large compared especially to what has been done in the past. But of course, it's not as large as you would wish to have when you work with corpus. But well, that was the process. So what did we find? Let's look at just the results for act. So what I'm gonna do is look at the active, the passive, and see if we can even theoretically and statistically somehow compare these two. So in table 1, you have all the results that we got from active causative. In this case, there are only 10 roots, not the 11, because va doesn't have an active form, which derives from the transitive root. So this is also interesting, right? Because va only has passive forms that derive from the transitive root. So we remove that. We remove that from the data. And if we just think about what we wanted to find at the beginning, right? We wanted to only find if they would use, if the embedded subject would appear in accusative or an oblique. It's a very novel goal, right? But then look at the table. Only 19% of what we intended to find, we actually found, right? So from all 775, only 90 instances were clear and ambiguous ak, and only 56 were clear and ambiguous oblique ak. Now here, oblique ak includes instances of genitive ak and also the instrument ak. And I think there is one instance of a dative ak, if I'm not mistaken. So this makes it very hard, right, to interpret. So what can we say about this interesting table when we have no arguments at all? So we have 63 instances. We have no embedded subject, but object, 339, which is a large number, right? We have instances in which we have the embedded subject, but not object. These are also very interesting because it's 226. And, you know, like the smaller group was the ones that we wanted to find, actually. Also, another interesting thing is that variation between the roots, right? So you can see how some can, like Bush, have 196 instances of act 0, right? But then a root like Pash to Cook has 0. So there's a great variation, which is not ideal when you want to do statistical work, but well, that's what we have in the data. So what can we say, or what have you been thinking about this data? Well, first of all, let's think about Panini, right? Because that's the first point of reference with this, with previous studies. So here we group the table according to what Panini predicted, right? He argued that it was possible. So only instances of, or roots that can only take inst ac, roots that can go either way, and roots that can be ac. What we found here, and you can see that even though this group was supposedly to only have oblique ac, it actually has ac. So what we find is that the ac construction is not as restricted as Panini says, okay? So we have, for example, in 3a and 3b, we have examples of han, to kill, or that, to give, with an ac pattern, okay? So you can see that these are possible. There also has been the discussion that what came first. It's like the chicken, the hen, or the egg, right? If ac came first or oblique ac came first, and you have different stories in the literature. What has been clear is that early Vedic did not like the instrumental accusative argument structure, it preferred the ak or the genitive or dative ak. This is what we find in early Vedic. Now, when we have like a deeper look into the data, now this data, we also label with the kind of text. So we have not just the instance, like the actual token, but we also have information about from which text, right? We gathered this. So when we look at deeper into that, because it could be very easy, okay, Panini was not right? Like what he described is not accurate. But when we look at the actual data, we see that 33 instances that go against the traditional classification. So for example, 25 ak instead of oblique ak, or 8 oblique ak instead of ak. So 10 are pre-Paninian, 11 are from the epics. And we know that the epics are complicated, right? Because they have pre-Paninian features. They just gather, since it's being built over time, they were created over time, they also have pre-Paninian features. And the remaining 12 are post-Paninian from a variety of genre, mainly narratives. So all we could say with that respect is ak is not as restricted as we find in the traditional grammar. Now, I said before that in the modern studies, it's been argued that there is a difference, semantic difference between argument structures with ak and argument structures with oblique ak. And they focus on that semantic distinction. Now, when we look at the data, so we look at the actual examples. So for example, through in number 4, to here, it could appear in a configuration with genitive ak, oblique ak, or well, in this case, it's instrument ak, or zero ak. But when we look at this construction, so he makes pleasant speech heard by the people, he who causes the mantra to be heard by the guru, those who make the best of twice-borns heard the secret stories, the man who causes to be heard and who hears it. It's very hard to make that semantic argument, right? Like, it's really hard to see what the differences are, especially in terms of agency. Now, of course, they are different. There are other roots which you could see a little bit more of a difference. So for example, graha, to take. So in a construction with oblique ak versus one with ak. So for example, 5, A and B. So once the king has been informed of how things stand, he will make you take his daughter's hand. So he will make you take his daughter's hand. And the other one will be, they look at the man of despicable character, place him under confinement, and arrange for me to take the hand of the young lady in marriage. So it seems like there's a slightly differences in agency. How much control do they have? But again, it's not a very marked difference. Now, we also have the question, as I said, what with the instrument causative? Hawk has been one scholar who has argued that this is an innovation in the language, which derives from the common instrumental use, okay, in Sanskrit. So from instrumental be related to non-animated, to being associated with animated elements, then it also became the use of the embedded subject with the instrument. And we can see that it's possible that this is a development in the language, because the instrument case is kind of, it can have an ambiguous reading. So it can be used as a causer, embedded subject, or an ambiguous reading. So for example, and it is caused to be known by the gods. So here we assume that the gods are the ones causing, right, to be known, not immediately, but the ones who desired. Or let the reminder be made known by the lady. This is, the instrument here is embedded subject. So the lady is actually the one doing the action. And then we have cases that let my advice be caused to be given by you, which is ambiguous between both readings. Now, what interesting aspect with this high frequency of zero acts, so we have 339 instances, and it's well above the oblique ac and the ac combined, is that it seems that it could be a separate formation, or at least has become one. And this correlates with the fact that many other causatives don't have a genuine causative sense. Okay, so it seems to be a development that later is seen in Middle Indic. Okay, it's been reported by Edgerton. And also we can argue that the use of the extensive use of zero ac may represent the beginnings of the loss of causativity in the causative. Also, it's very interesting that a lot of these constructions occur with the imperative. Okay, with imperative. So we wonder if maybe there is actually a shifting, okay, in the use of the causative. Remember, usually in linguistics, we learn that with a causative formation, we add to the valence, right? We add participants into the action. But what we are seeing here in the data in Sanskrit is that that's not the case. You really don't add. What it seems to be happening is that you're shifting focus rather than adding valence. And then we have cases in which zero and zero ac in principle correspond to both ac or oblique ac, but we might expect them more to correlate with oblique ac if we assume the core object to be less submissible. So this is also like, these are interesting assumptions, right? That if you think about the difference between complements and adjuncts that is discussed in principles in linguistics, what is more likely to be omitted, right? So this is a question that we've been asking about which would be more likely to be omitted in these instances. And then ac zero, they're also frequent, but then we also believe that a lot of these constructions, especially with the root bush, actually corresponds to ac ends, which has a very idiomatic meaning. So we are very hesitant to include these instances in a further statistic. So I think I can make a pause here and see if there are some questions.
Address the questions. Yes,
For
there are two, Adriana. Shall I
Okay.
read them out?
Yes, please.
So the first one is from Samarpriya, and he's asking, does that imply that the non-pre-Panini texts somehow are forced into sticking to Paninian laws, since by this time it's very likely that the people composing these texts are modern Indo-Aryan speakers, that is, who do not speak Sanskrit or Old Indo-Aryan natively. And
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
is that.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to look deeper into the text, because what happens with Panini is that it's been taken in Sanskrit studies as the last word. So that's the law, the grammatical law. But that's not true, right? Because this is, I mean, what we see in the text in Sanskrit is rather complex, because we know that these come from an oral tradition that has been composed over time. So what we wanted to do here is rather say, wait, okay, Panini accounts for usage at a particular time and most likely a particular region. But that doesn't mean that this is what we are going to find in all texts, right? So whatever we find pre-Panini will be pre-grammaticalization or standardization. So of course we expect to see more variation. Wherever, later text post-Paninian, then we expect it to, tend to conform more to grammatical standards. But pre-Paninian, then we'll expect to see more variation.
Yeah, just a clarification, the MIA was Middle Indo-Aryan, not Modern Indo-Aryan. Okay, the second question is from Aisha, and she's asking, can you go to example 4? She's asking about example 4. Is Sanskrit hear and listen the same root? Could some of the examples in 4 be the listen meaning of hear?
Oh, the listen meaning, oh yeah, well, yes. Yeah, that's a good question. It could be. It could very Washed P. We have listed, yeah, to causative to be listened. Well, who listens to it? He makes pleasant speech to be listened by the people. I mean, do you think that maybe it would make a semantic difference if we change this for listen? Well, I would have to
Yeah,
probably have discussion with people who work more on semantics than we do.
yeah, no, if Adriana, if I may come in just briefly, you know what? So a lot of the in modern Indo-Aryan Hindi, so there is, when you take the intentional meaning, it
Mm-hmm.
seems to correlate with the difference in case marking. So if I say I heard a song and I don't use the accusative slash dative, right? Then I say for the want of translate, let me translate. The basic root is just here. Maine gana suna. I heard a
Mm.
song, and when I put the case marking onto the a song, then I get a listened to. So I get an intentional meaning of the predicate.
Oh, okay. Mm.
Right, and so because the facts that of the bubonic the affectedness agency of the causae, and if you're looking, or
Mm.
intended expression, so I'm wondering whether there is an intentional shift, slight meaning shift in the predicate. So it's quite possible that even in modern Indo-Aryan, just looking at the root here, even with a causative,
Mm.
I don't know if the intentional meaning change is signaled by the case marking, even in Sanskrit.
Yes, that's what is being argued, right? But when
Right,
we look at these sentences in context, it's very hard to make the
right.
difference. That's the
Especially with, I
problem.
think it could be that, just, it's not it's real, it's not that you don't cover both meanings with the root plus causative, but it's with one case marking, you actually um, privilege the intentional reading of the predicate.
Yes, and that's what is being argued precisely. But again, the issue that we're having with the cases in which we find this variation, this optionality in the case marking, is that when we look at the larger context, that's not so clear. That it is very hard to make a distinction that that's the case. Although the assumption is that that's the case, right? Because otherwise, why would you make the difference? That
And so
there's
when you said your corpus was looking at things with translations, it's from what source the translation? Because this heard and listen, you can see it in Indian English speakers,
yes,
if
uh,
in English as well, right? We don't have that same. So whose translation is?
yes, and that's been a debate since the beginning of putting together the corpus,
Uh,
because we wanted to look at text that we have different translations of, right? The, like different, of course, that's not always possible, but at least a translation. Why? Because what happens, and that's true, right? What you happen with undocumented languages is that you tend to impose a reading, right? So you
right.
wanted to make it truly causative, and we wanted to see if there was a variation or ambiguity in the different translations that will make the translators to hesitate or to decide on one reading over the other. And then we make a decision on the translation that we have, right? Um, but of course, it's not perfect. I mean, it will never be perfect, because if we provide a translation ourselves, then there is always the risk of, if we only consider our translation, there is always the risk that we are imposing the causative reading with the intentionality, or uh, less or more agency, etc. Right? So we
Mhm.
wanted to be able to be accountable somehow, but
Yeah,
again, it's not perfect. And most of this translation come from the 18th century, 19th century, and then we end up with other varieties of English and other uses and another discussion, right, on some of these translation. But this is a good, I mean, it's a good point. And what we wanted, and we are still working on this. And what the points that we wanted to note here is that it's not as straight cut as is being argued, especially when you
Yeah,
look at
and
the major, larger corpus, right? Like text.
I mean, I don't want to derail you too much, but if one separated this with the case marking, at the argument structure template a little bit, and said that thought of a process happening in the causative, happening in the non-causative as well, which is something like DOM, right? Differential object marking. That, you know, you're really doing something, you have an independent process. So there is some template given to you by the causative morphology structure, case relation template. But on that, something more can act, which is an independent process.
Exactly.
And
And
then you know, maybe one could clarify the data according to that, rather than putting it all on the argument structure template. So I mean, the point you're making is really good. It shows that, but you do need to perhaps make this point.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't have just one process. Maybe you have two.
Yes, and that's what we are trying. So because at first we said, okay, we don't have enough data to see what is happening, but actually then no, the data is telling us what is happening, right?
Yeah.
So other than imposing an ACAC reading or oblique reading and saying, okay, there is this clear distinction between these two, it seems like another process is going on here. So the fact that this embedded, that there is no subject, right? That there is no doer, tells you something too. Tells you that there's probably a change going on in the language towards a just simple transitive meaning, right? That there is a loss of this distinction. And maybe it's a shifting also in how we conceive causatives. As I said, not just adding balance, but maybe shifting focus, right? Like what is being focused in the construction? How important is the doer?
Why would you want to see that necessarily only in and as a process of diachrony? Why can't it be a stable process in whatever synchronic stage of the language here? Because focus is a different imperative.
Yeah, it is a different.
Right, and presumably they were not all acting in Ramayan serials and where every word is focused, and they needed to speak in discourse, and therefore, you know, you could use the causative, because the English causative also gives you, English passive also gives you prominence.
Oh, we are looking at other keys too, so other cues. So for example, the extensive use of the imperative seems to be like a politeness marker in this causative. Then also animacy also tends to be, and I will see it with the
Okay, so I don't want to, we can have this conversation.
Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. So if there are no more questions, then I'll continue with what we found for the passive.
Yeah, no more questions right now.
Okay, perfect. So as I said, we started with passive. So actually I went, you know, all the way around. And in the passives, so we established those 11 roots, and we wanted to see what was preferred. If we could predict when would an embedded subject be passivized and when would an embedded object be passivized, right? So we look at these roots, and here you have the preferences for the finite passive. Here you have the preferences for tap participle, and here the total numbers. Now, one question is why tap participle here? Well, tap participles have a passive meaning, but we also know, and this is something that we are still investigating, is that tap participle is so frequent in Sanskrit that it has an actual separate use too, which is something that we're trying to see how do we make sense of what we have based on that. But what we did is consider the passive reading, and then we said, okay, we have a finite and a non-finite form for that causative, right? So we have these roots, and the first thing that you find is that there is great variation, right, in what can be passivized. So for example, there is a majority of passivization of the object in finite constructions versus passivization of the subject. But there is not great variation in terms of the top participle, which I think is very interesting. Now among the roots, you also have, again, great variation. So for example, a root by path, only we found one instance in passivization of the subject. With the top participle forms of this root, we found 3 instances. So it seems like there are no, maybe there's no option of passivizing the object. We don't know, because that's another issue with corpus, right? It doesn't mean that you didn't find it, doesn't mean that it's not possible, it's just that it wasn't there. We also find, for example, shnya, to know. So we find that both forms are possible, but in the top participle, PCS is more common. We also have roots such as han, which is what is being reported in the past. So one case of PCO in the finite forms, but look at the top participle, 73 forms. Now, also, if you look at the non-finite forms, you see that they account for 70% of the forms that are here. So this construction, the passive causative in finite form, is not as frequent. That's something that we found. Now, how do we interpret this based on what is being said in the past? Or how do we make sense of this? Well, in prior studies, they saw that passivization of the embedded object was rare, but then you can see that it's not that rare when you just widen the pool of roots and constructions. So you can see again that PCO 52 instances finite, 214 instances in the top participle. So at the end, the proportion of PCS is almost 50%, right, of the forms that we found. So PCO is not as rare as it was said before. Now again, variation in the roots. So Han is entirely PCO, and we find it also with imperative. So again, it seems like the omission of both the agent and the subject, embedded subject, is possible, focusing most likely on whoever is going to be dead, the dead person, right? Kri, to carry, is mostly PCO, so it behaves similarly as Han. Kri, to do, is part PCO, part PCS. This has been said or considered semantically empty. I don't like that. What I would prefer to say is that Kri is used as in Hindi, right, in a variety of constructions. So since you can have these compound verbs, so you can actually expand or have a great deal of possibilities. So it's not surprising that you can find passivization of both the object and the subject pretty much equally. We see dashnya, to know, and shru, to hear, and some other verbs. We find PCS with people, so make someone hear, know, listen, right? And PCO with things, so make something hear or to be known or to be listened. And this is something that I've been wondering if is a consequence of the construction or a cause of the construction. So in other words, if animicity is actually pushing the preference, or rather it's just a consequence of the fact that most agents are animate and most objects are inanimate, right? And I'm inclining towards the second, the latter, that is just a consequence of whatever we are finding. Now it's interesting to see that, so again, PCS is mainly plus animate plus human, and PCO is minus animate minus human. But then, of course, we find women in PCO, right? Like for example, to give away or to take or to marry, right? To lead. So the woman here is not marked or considered animate or plus human. And this about the compounds, this is also, I mean, it's just interesting. It's not surprising because Sanskrit compound formation in Sanskrit is very pervasive. So it's not surprising that this participle in the causative is actually quite common, and that we can find this variation between PCO and PCS also with members of the compound. So that's what you have in 14. So again, we started, just to recap a little bit, we started looking at only passive causatives, and we saw this variation, right? This variation in table 2. And we were wondering what is motivating, or what is the deciding element in Sanskrit to go with a root and passivize the object, or passivize the subject, or never allowing to passivize the object, for example. And then we say, okay, let's look at the active and see if the argument structure of the active has anything to do with it. But as you can see, you can recall from table 1, it was not very helpful. So, but the question remained, right? Theoretically, are these two even connected? So what we wanted to do, and I thought about, okay, statistically, how can you even connect these two? So we run with the assumption that has not been investigated before. I mean, it's being thought that maybe from what Panini said, this follows, but again, it's not an argument that has been made in the past, which is that you have passivization of the embedded subject, or PCS, whenever in the active you have the possibility of an act construction. Whereas you have passivization of the embedded object, or PCO, whenever in the active you have oblique act. And well, in syntax, we've been having this discussion of why is that the case. There's been argued in the past that there is a difference between these two objects. One is called a core object, the other one is not. And what does that mean in this construction? And looking back at table 1, again, this is a difficulty in trying to compare these two, is that most of the instances don't even have information about the embedded subject, right? So, I mean, if we look at the table, we look part, recite 5 versus 8, shnya, to know. So there is a tendency towards passivization of the embedded subject, and then these tend to be akak, right? So you could say, okay, it follows the assumption, but then it's not clear. It's far from being clear when you look at the other roots. So when we try to compare these, there are different challenges. First, the data of the active causative is more restrictive. Not all causative forms were genuine causative. Some maintained the simple transitive meaning as the nasal presence. Others were used as idioms. Then others were ambiguous, right? In the transitive or intransitive base. Then the embedded subject is not often explicit, so that left us without much data for comparison. So in statistics, this makes it very hard, but there is one tool, which is the basic. It's the first thing that you can do in order to establish a relationship, and that is the correlation matrix. So I thought, okay, let's run with a correlation matrix. And actually we performed several with different combinations, and I can discuss those with you later. So let's go with this. And what the correlation matrix does is it measures the dependence between two variables, right? So it's the first, again, as I said, it's the first thing that you could do in statistics to see if it's worth pursuing anything else. So the correlation is expressed in this way. So it's measured from a scale from -1 to +1, and the closer the value is to +1 or -1, then the more closely to those the two variables are related. So a positive correlation means that both move together in the same direction, and an increasing one is followed by an increase in the other, and the opposite, right? That the reduction in one is accompanied by the reduction in the other. And if you have a negative value, then it represents the negative correlation. So this means that one increases, the other one decreases, and vice versa. And when you have a value of 0, then that means that there is no correlation between them. So I run this, and then I thought, okay, let's do the p-values to see which of these correlations will be significant. And in table 3, you have the results of one of them. As I said, we run different ones. I wanted to see if, since this is the first of a statistical approach, how could we group these variables or categories that will give us hints of what is going on here. What is interesting, and it's not here the table, but I can share it if any of you wanted to see it, is that whenever you separate the values for the passive forms, then somehow the finite and the tap participles are correlated. So I've been wondering if this is just an overweight in the data, because the data is so small, then sometimes you could have overweights with this statistical method. But what we have here, so we have passivization of the subject, of the object, and then the other possible combinations in the actives. And what we find here, which is the 0.95, this is a very high correlation. And you can see that is a significant p-value between 0-AC and PCO. And what is interesting too is that whenever you have an AC0 with the PCO, you have a negative correlation, but it's not statistically significant. But whenever you have an AC0 and a passive PCS, then you have a high correlation of 81, and this is statistically significant. So this is what we found so far. And what this means is that our assumption is partly confirmed, right? So the results partly support the claim that there is a correlation between the patterns forming the active and the passives, but only for those when you have 0-AC and AC0. So ideally, in an ideal world, you will find, if you find a high correlation on this, you would also find a response whenever you have the oblique AC. But we are not really finding it statistically significant, right? So you see 0.09. So you'll say, okay, it's high here and low here, but really not much. And then the opposite here, right? If you find this 0, you should find this very high, but that's not the case. I mean, here is no correlation and here is negative correlation, but we don't have much. So as a conclusion, just to start closing, some closing remarks, causatives and their passives in Sanskrit are of interest because they often don't occur together, which is something that is interesting. And we don't find in every single language the option of the two argument structures for both the active and the causative. So this is something that Sanskrit allowed us to do, right? Then the variation between AC and oblique AC, as well as PCO and PCS, is more complex than described in previous work. And this will be most likely the case all the time when you work with a large corpus, right? Because then you'll add more genre and text from different periods, so you are more likely, will find more variation. Many causative and passive causative appear more like transitive verbs than true causatives. So that makes us think that there has been a change, which is a change that is not uncommon. So for example, those languages that have also the Proto-Indo-European suffix, most of them have also gone through the transitive path. In other words, they don't have the true causative meaning, but rather the transitive meaning. Sanskrit, we can find both, but it seems like there was a change that is sort of reflected in the argument structure, in the sense that the embedded subject is omitted in most texts, in most constructions. There is also great variation in the roots. but we wonder if this is rather due to pragmatic notions or animacy. But this is something that we're still trying to figure out, because of course it takes longer to go back to the text and then look at the larger fragments, right? And then we found a partial correlation between active and passive, but this doesn't allow us to go to like a more sophisticated um, statistical model. Why? Well, because the kind of data we're dealing with is frequency, which restricts the kind of methods that we can apply, because the sample is small, so we can't fall with overweight of some of these. In other words, the statistics would tell us that something is truly significant when in reality it's not, because we don't have much data. So, and then the other thing that is interesting is the tab participle constructions. It's being argued that they have a negative value, right? Especially in Middle Indic and then in Modern Indic. That whatever ergativity constructions we find in these languages result from these Sanskrit kind of constructions. So what we expect to see in this correlation is that tab participles will align more with the active ones than with the finite passives. And we run different correlations to see if that was the case, but they are not significant. So we cannot say based on causative that that's the case. Although it's interesting to see if with other constructions we can see it more clearly. So now we are starting to look in control and see if there are differences or not. But this is a topic that remains open. The same as what is the function of the passive in Sanskrit, because it's used so frequently that is probably will not align with what you find in other languages where the use is more restrictive. So that's something that we also investigated. And as I said at the beginning, we're trying to look into other typological data to see how this occurs in other languages, especially, well, it would be nice to have more data on other Indian languages and see if how this has been also investigated. Because as far as we know, this is the first time that when we are trying to match both, right? Like that whatever argument structure we find in the active with the constructions that we find in the passives. And if we are wrong and someone has done this before, we would like to see how our results were, if it were successful or not. And again, we are also still working on some of this data, because we are going back to some of the major texts and see if the semantic differences that were proposed before they really follow through, right? If they're truly systematic or not. And this is all for me. I imagine that we can open the floor for more questions.
Thanks so much, Adriana, for the talk. If anyone has questions, this is the time to ask them.
Yang, your voice is not very clear. It's a little subdued. So can you check your mic, please?
Is it better now?
Only slightly.
Okay. Adriana,
Yeah.
there's a question.
Okay.
Am I audible to you?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to read it out. I think some recent scholars, Verbeke, Kleiman, Haig, etc., challenged the traditional view that the ta participle instrumental construction, which is also seen in Old Persian, except that the genitive is preferred to Sanskrit's instrumental, gives rise to ergativity in Indo-Aryan and Indo-Iranian, in Iranian. In any case, a parallel Iranian study would be interesting too in the comparative scheme of things. It's a comment, actually.
Okay, it's a comment. Yeah, true. It is true. Yeah, but still, right? I mean, when you have data, we have this kind of data, even if it's in the causative, we want to see if there is anything that will hint towards one direction or the other, right? And that's what we're trying to see here too. If there is any parallel between what you see in the active and the tap participle, and how different they can be from the actual finite passive forms. So far, we haven't found much, but that's a good comment.
And then if I may, so what do we know about when subjects can be null in Sanskrit pro drop? I read some stuff, but I must say I don't remember. And then I don't know whether it's based on any corpus study. So because I was wondering where the cases where you have no subjects at all, or where you have object drop. And so therefore there are a large number of cases because after all they're text. Is what can we, I mean, is there any way that you can do more stuff with them? For example, I was just doing, if you look at an equi-NP deletion test in any of the modern Indo-Aryan languages, what you see, if you have coordinate structure, but you don't have to necessarily coordinate, then dropping the oblique marked subjects, they can trigger nominative drop, but they are not so easily dropped themselves, subject pro, which are case marked. So yes. I wanted to know whether, do we know anything about Sanskrit pro drop, when do you get object drop, and also if whether these cases could then be reduced a little bit more, the variation.
Yes, that's a very good question. So it seems like Sanskrit removes elements freely.
I mean, they've always said that, but I couldn't believe it. But so therefore, I wanted to know it.
Exactly. I mean, that's something that we also thought, right? I mean, you always think, and it's kind of a principle in linguistics. The language is case marked, and there is free word order, and then you can remove elements freely, right? And then we wanted to see if that was the case, but really, so far we haven't seen any pattern. Or evident pattern whereas where do you do it seems to be conditioned by also that kind of text, and then the kind of the context, because for example lots of these for example the king made someone who killed someone, or ordered to Devarata to be killed, right? It really doesn't matter who does the killing. Probably one of his warriors, soldiers, whatever. What matters is that person is killed, and then the king ordered it, right? And often what happens in that construction is that there is only a verb in imperative, and we know that it was the king because we look previous in the text, but in the sentence itself the king is not there, is not present, right? So I mean, so far we see like a lot of flexibility in what can be removed. And as I said, even with act, so I thought at the beginning, okay, if you have two objects, then you have the possibility of promoting in the passive either of those, right? And what has been said in the past is that there is an animacy restriction. So if one act, so the embedded subject act is animate, and the embedded object act is inanimate, then most likely what happened in the passive is that the animate will be passivized, right? But then what we find in the data is that it can go either way, so it really doesn't matter. But what is important is that both are available. Now what happens with oblique act, it seems like syntactically only one is available, right? So only the object is available, and that's what seems to be happening. Now how do you make that into the theory? That's what we've been discussing, especially because we come from different frameworks. So John is more LFG framework, whereas I've been trained mainly in generative grammar. So this has been like a discussion on how do we approach this, and if we really have that much data to be able to go one way or the other. But I mean,
So
the
it helps to
thing,
separate. And so, what you, because you're starting only, when you're doing only transitives, you've only taken transitive roots and you've taken a genuine causative meaning, but you're based, so therefore some patterns, is it necessarily clarifying in the sense that if you had taken intransitives that go to transitive, do we see some pattern where the effects of animacy
yeah,
and those become clearer? So because this student of mine, which I had done this, she looked at causative, passive, etc. in Hindi. And one thing that came out, that actually it's at the level of the derivation from intransitive to transitive that these features like animacy play a huge role.
yes, and that's what we find, right? Especially
Yeah.
in the passive. I think especially in the passive, that's what we find in the alternations of, let me see, like this one, for example, 13. So we do find that. But that's what I wonder, if what you find is a consequence of the construction or the cause of the construction, right? In other words, if the animus is really a restriction here in the argument structure or not. And
But the her argument is actually that it is, because when you, so if you take a route like Bloom, and you, of course, it's all modern stuff, so you're looking at diagnostics of whether, so when you have an animate subject of an unaccusative, it shows more unergative diagnostic properties
okay.
than when you have an inanimate subject of the same unaccusative. That looks like a really, like that subject stays really low. You don't, I think you don't get the
You
same
don't
kind.
tend to promote it, yes.
Yes, and so the animates tend to get promoted. And if you look at modern Indo-Aryan, the requirement that humans must be marked with some case marking, etc. That's just one way. That's got nothing to do with the predicate. So that there are two different conditions. But
Yes.
but in the passive, you can actually, you lose the humanness requirement.
Yes.
So I can say Anita was seen in the market with an unaccusative construction, and then I don't need to say, in fact, I cannot use the marking at all. So, for the Hindi speakers, so Anita market mein dikhi. I can't say then Anita ko market mein dikhi. So that, so there is, so what I was trying to say earlier is that you're looking, I mean, if you look at one synchronic stage in the language, so many of the things that you're seeing over, which suggest change, I think, is it something that one could even think of looking from a corpus and looking at one stage of a language and say, okay, do I need all these rules to describe that
Exactly.
synchronic stage of the language? So we're not looking in terms of change.
Exactly.
And how these rules distribute, how much of them are argument structure level, how much of them are rules of syntax.
Yes, exactly. And that's what we're trying to see too, because this majority of 0 and 0x that occur here, they actually are from classical Sanskrit. So you could actually analyze this synchronically. So if you just look at this synchronically, you can see that the function of the causative is not what it has been argued to be.
Right.
And I think that's the key part on this, that you could go either way. I mean, you could easily go towards a more diachronic study and see how many instances of inst ac or ac occur, over the course of the years of the text. But actually what is interesting here is that it just it completely throws off the previous statement, and causative always adds balance or adds to the
Ah,
balance. And it rather seems to be focused on zero arguments, and then when the argument is present tends to be the object. So
yeah,
but it's also is related to the notion of transitivity, right? Because if
yes,
the verb is transitive and it occurs with the object, so most likely that will be the argument that will not be dropped, right? Because it's kind of a requirement of transitivity of
yes.
transitive. So that's something that is interesting. Although we also find these act zero constructions, which are frequent, but since most of them come from this kind of root, then we are hesitant to make much of it because we believe that maybe some of these are actually not act but act-ins. So that's a kind of an idiomatic reading that we find in some of the Puranas. So just for example, to feed the priest with ghee or to feed the priest with whatever
Mm,
kind of
yeah,
food, right? So this is what we find like, but if, so we remove this, it's more clearly the pattern, the synchronic pattern of what we really find in the causative in Sanskrit, right? Which is an absence of oral arguments and then a focus on the object
mm, yeah, that's,
rather than these grammatical rules on one, you know, when is act, when is oblique.
yeah. Yeah, but this table was fascinating actually. This,
Yes, I think so. I agree. It's not, of course, the first time that after passive we go into that is like, why us? Right? We wanted to see a clear distribution on when was accusative and when was oblique, but that's not what happens in Sanskrit, and but that actually what is interesting, right? On this.
mm, is there another question?
Yeah, so we have another question. So Sakshi is asking, do you control for the use of instrumental for causes and tools? Are they marked similarly? If yes, do you find double instrumentals in passive causatives? Example, the minister was caused to be killed by someone by using poison.
No, we did not find it. We did not find the double instrument, which was what we expected, right? I mean, we expected, so we go to the section, yeah, section, no, wait, this is, yeah, 3.1. So there is, oh no, sorry, here. So there is always the possibility of the wood is made to be cut by the Vadatta by Yajnadatta. And what actually we find is that in these cases, or in the cases like B to B, what we actually find, if anything, if it's not just the wood is made to be cut, that would be what happens most of the cases. If we do find an instrument, it would be the wood is made to be cut by the Vadatta, meaning that the Vadatta did the action, or the wood is made to be cut by Yajnadatta, meaning that he caused the action, or an ambiguous reading, but we don't find both. I don't know if that answers the question. So we do not find by the
I think
Vadatta,
it
by
does.
Yajnadatta.
Sakshi said, thanks.
Which is also, I mean, we expect this too, right? Because, I mean, just think about the modern language. It's just, you try to say as little as possible that will be clear or will be ambiguous, right? I mean, we'll go to the Gracian principles too. I mean, you usually don't have so many elements and so much information, right, in a sentence.
Any questions? I guess we don't have any more questions today. Adriana, thank you so much for the talk. It was something really new to us because we barely get to hear much about Sanskrit. Uh, also, if someone has, I think Sakshi has added something, I'm just going to read that out, but there will be an animistic contrast between the causae and the tool, so there's still a chance to observe those.
Oh yes, I mean yes, and when it's a causative, yes, but then you have some ambiguous, right? Because so you could have something like, let's see, Devadatta was killed by the arrows, and then you wonder if it's just the arrows or just the instrument, or does it imply the arrows of Arjuna, right? Or what do they want to say here, that they actually, the arrows have some divine power and that's why they're doing the killing? I mean, they can be ambiguous cases too, in which there is no clear cut between what is inanimate instrument and animate causer, right? So it could be, and we know that this is possible in Sanskrit literature, right? Like certain inanimate elements have actually animate properties because they tend to be divine and or have like certain powers, etc. So some constructions like that could be ambiguous.
Thanks for clarifying that, Adriana. So if anybody has any more questions, I guess not then. Okay, so we are done for today. If you have anything else you would like to ask, I'm sure Adriana would be happy to have you email her.
Yes, please email me, and if you have more data about other wonderful Indian languages, please email me too.
Actually, speaking of that, I was just trying to find that. We had a workshop with Rajesh Bhatt at Mumbai University. I believe it was in 2017. Some of the participants here today were also at the workshop, and we had collected, I mean, we had basically sat down and made tables of intransitive, transitive, various valency positions of all the verbs. I mean, lots of verbs in our languages. I think we had worked on Marathi, Hindi, Bangla, I guess also Tamil. So I'm not sure how you could access that data, but if you individually contacted everyone who worked on it, you could
That would
you
be,
could have
yeah,
a
that
look
would
at
be
those
very
tables.
helpful. That would be wonderful. Yes, that'd be great.
Yeah, if people on the group are here, you can always get in touch with Adriana.
Yes, please.
So yeah, so we are done for today, and thank you so much for listening, for being here, and see you with the next talk. And yeah, we're done. Adriana, thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.